Stellantis just dropped another bomb on the American auto industry, and this one is hitting workers right where it hurts. The company has officially announced that it's moving production overseas, shifting jobs and manufacturing capacity away from the United States. For decades, automakers have promised to keep jobs at home, but time and time again, when costs get too high or when government policies push them in another direction, the first thing to go is American labor. This isn't just about one factory shutting down. It's about a massive strategy shift that could reshape the entire auto market. When Stellantis was formed in 2021, merging Fiat Chrysler with PSA Group, many analysts warned that American operations would be vulnerable. Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, and Ram are legendary brands here in the US, but they're not the profit engines they once were. Stellantis has been pouring resources into Europe and electrification projects abroad, while cutting investments in American plants. Now, with rising labor costs, political uncertainty, and slowing demand for certain models, Stellantis has decided that shipping jobs overseas makes more financial sense. But what makes sense for shareholders often destroys communities. This move means fewer union jobs in the US, more layoffs in already struggling towns, and an even bigger blow to America's shrinking manufacturing base. It's the same cycle we've seen for decades. Factories close, jobs vanish, and families are left scrambling. But this time it's happening at a moment when the U.S. auto industry is already in chaos. Electric vehicle demand is cooling, supply chains are still fragile, and competition from China is rising fast. Instead of doubling down on America, Stellantis is betting on cheaper labor markets and global flexibility. For American workers, this is a harsh reminder that loyalty doesn't go both ways. You can dedicate your life to building cars for decades, only to find out that decisions made in a European boardroom will decide whether your town thrives or dies. Politicians will talk tough, unions will fight back, but history tells us that once production leaves, it almost never comes back. The muscle cars, trucks, and SUVs that used to be American icons may soon be built on foreign soil, stamped with global parts, and shipped back to U.S. showrooms. And here's the bigger picture. This isn't just Stellantis. Other automakers are watching closely. If Stellantis gets away with slashing American production without major backlash, expect others to follow. Ford, GM, even Tesla are all under the same pressures. Costs are rising, margins are shrinking, and foreign governments are offering massive subsidies to lure production. The United States, once the global center of car manufacturing, is losing ground fast. Let's talk about the brands most Americans actually care about: Jeep, Ram, and Dodge. These aren't just cars. They're cultural staples. Jeep has always been marketed as the rugged American adventure vehicle, the one tied to freedom and exploration. Ram trucks are positioned as the backbone of American labor, built for farms, construction sites, and hard work. Dodge is supposed to represent muscle and performance, the very essence of Detroit horsepower. Now imagine those same brands being built overseas, far from the communities and workers who gave them life. The image doesn't just take a hit. The entire identity of these brands risks collapsing. Jeep production shifting abroad means fewer American-made SUVs rolling out of factories like Toledo. That's a factory town that has built Jeeps for generations, where entire families have counted on those jobs for stability. If Stellantis cuts deeper there, the economic ripple effect will crush small businesses, schools, and housing markets tied to those paychecks. For Ram, it's even more dangerous. Trucks are the most profitable vehicle Stellantis has in the U.S. right now, and moving their production overseas would shatter the "built in America" narrative that sells them. Buyers who see a Ram truck stamped, "Made in Mexico," or "Made in Poland," may not be so eager to pay premium prices for a product that no longer feels authentically American. Dodge, already struggling with shrinking sales, is in the most fragile position. The brand's iconic Challenger and Charger muscle cars are being phased out as Stellantis pushes electrification. But if their replacements aren't built in America, Dodge risks becoming just another global brand with no unique tie to the U.S. This could be the final blow to a nameplate that once defined American performance cars. And Stellantis knows this, but the cost savings and government incentives abroad seem to outweigh brand loyalty. The political fallout here is inevitable. Lawmakers will pound the table about saving American jobs, but they've been making the same speeches for decades as factories have shut down one after another. What's different now is that the EV transition has made production more flexible. Automakers can choose where to build batteries, where to source minerals, and where to assemble vehicles based on subsidies and labor costs. Europe and China are offering billions to attract plants, while the U.S. response is inconsistent, tied up in politics and red tape. Stellantis sees that landscape clearly, and they're making cold, calculated moves. And let's not forget the unions. The UAW just fought for historic wage gains, but higher labor costs here may have accelerated Stellantis' decision to shift work elsewhere. It's a catch-22. Workers want fair pay, but companies chase profits. Stellantis now has an excuse to say, "We can't afford this in the U.S.," and quietly move production abroad. If this continues, the UAW may win on paper but lose in reality as the jobs themselves disappear. This decision doesn't just hurt American workers, it hands a massive advantage to China and other global automakers. While Stellantis pulls jobs out of the U.S., Chinese brands are scaling up production at breakneck speed, flooding global markets with affordable electric vehicles. They're not burdened by America's high labor costs or Europe's strict regulations. Instead, they're backed by aggressive government subsidies, streamlined supply chains, and cheap access to the critical minerals that power EV batteries. Every time an American factory goes dark, China's automakers get stronger, because it means fewer homegrown competitors in the global market. And it's not just China. South Korea, Mexico, and even Eastern Europe are aggressively competing for auto plants. They're offering tax breaks, energy incentives, and faster permit approvals. Compare that to the U.S., where companies like Stellantis face lengthy regulations, higher wages, and political battles over subsidies. It's not hard to see why the math pushes production offshore. But here's the catch. Once these factories and supply chains are established in other countries, they don't just benefit Stellantis. They lay the groundwork for rivals to dominate the very markets America once led. This is how industrial decline takes shape, not in one dramatic collapse, but in slow, deliberate decisions made by corporations that no longer see the U.S. as their priority. One factory at a time, one brand at a time, the industrial base erodes. And when America finally wakes up to the fact that entire segments of its auto industry have moved abroad, it may be too late to rebuild. Just look at what happened to steel, textiles, and electronics. Once they left, they never came back. For towns across the Midwest and South, this shift feels like déjà vu. Communities built around auto plants are about to face the same struggles as those that lost steel mills and coal jobs decades ago. Local diners, hardware stores, and small businesses that rely on factory workers will start closing. Tax revenue for schools and public services will shrink. Young people will move away in search of work, leaving behind hollowed-out towns with fewer opportunities. Stellantis' decision isn't just a corporate strategy. It's a direct hit to the social fabric of America's industrial heartland. But here's the most alarming part. This isn't happening in isolation. Ford has already warned of slowing EV demand and is shifting investments abroad. GM has quietly cut production targets and delayed U.S. EV launches. Even Tesla, once seen as America's crown jewel in innovation, is increasingly dependent on its Shanghai gigafactory. Stellantis moving production overseas is just another piece of evidence that America is losing control of its own auto future. For American consumers, Stellantis' overseas shift could completely change what ends up in their driveways, and at what price. At first glance, moving production abroad might sound like it could make cars cheaper. After all, lower labor costs and government incentives overseas should, in theory, reduce expenses. But in reality, consumers may not see those savings. Instead, Stellantis will pocket the difference while Americans pay the same, or even more, for vehicles that are no longer built here. There's also the question of availability. When production is moved overseas, cars must travel across oceans, passing through fragile supply chains and unpredictable shipping networks. We've already seen what happens when global trade is disrupted. Vehicles sit at ports, dealers run dry, and customers wait months for deliveries. By shifting production away from U.S. soil, Stellantis is making American buyers even more vulnerable to global shocks, whether it's political tensions, shipping bottlenecks, or raw material shortages. That means fewer vehicles on lots and higher prices for those lucky enough to grab one. And then there's the brand loyalty problem. Stellantis is gambling that Americans won't care if their Jeep, Ram, or Dodge is built overseas, as long as the badge stays the same. But history shows otherwise. Made in America has always carried weight in the truck and SUV market. Buyers want to feel like they're supporting domestic workers and driving something tied to American grit. If that narrative collapses, Stellantis risks alienating its most loyal base. And once loyalty is gone, It's almost impossible to get it back. Meanwhile, the used car market will feel the ripple too. If buyers turn away from new Stellantis vehicles because they're no longer US-made, demand for older, American-built Jeeps and Rams could skyrocket. That means higher used car prices, fewer choices, and an even tougher market for everyday buyers. So while Stellantis cuts costs, American consumers could actually end up paying more while getting less availability, less reliability, and less connection to the brands they love. But beyond the consumer angle, this move sets up a political firestorm in Washington. Lawmakers, on both sides of the aisle, are already under pressure to protect American jobs, and Stellantis just handed them the perfect target. Expect fiery speeches, hearings, and promises of new policies designed to keep manufacturing at home. But here's the twist. Many of these same politicians have backed trade deals and policies over the years that made it easier for companies to offshore jobs in the first place. The outrage may be loud, but whether it turns into real action is another story. The political battles this decision is about to ignite will be fierce. In Washington, Stellantis is about to become the poster child for corporate betrayal. Lawmakers will line up to slam the company for abandoning American workers, but their motivations won't always be pure. Some will use it to push for stricter trade policies, others to demand more subsidies for domestic EV and battery production, and still others will weaponize it for campaign talking points. What's clear is that Stellantis has painted a giant target on its back. Unions, especially the UAW, won't let this slide quietly either. After fighting tooth and nail for wage increases and job protections, seeing Stellantis move jobs overseas will feel like a slap in the face. Expect walkouts, protests, and a loud public campaign aimed at shaming the company. The UAW knows that once plants close, they rarely reopen, so this is a fight for survival. And they'll push lawmakers hard to penalize Stellantis, whether through tariffs, loss of incentives, or pressure on dealerships. But Stellantis, with its global reach, has the leverage. If one government resists, they can shift production elsewhere, leaving the UAW and Washington scrambling. Lobbyists will flood Capitol Hill on both sides. Stellantis will argue that overseas production is necessary to stay competitive, pointing to global competition and supply chain realities. Their allies will quietly remind lawmakers that shutting Stellantis out of federal incentives could backfire, costing even more American jobs in dealerships, logistics, and part suppliers. Meanwhile, union-backed lobbyists will call for tough measures to stop offshoring, framing this as a national security and economic stability issue. This tug-of-war will be intense, but history suggests the corporations usually win, finding loopholes and compromises that allow them to proceed largely as planned. At the state level, governors and local officials in auto-heavy regions like Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana will feel the pressure the most. Losing a Stellantis plant doesn't just cut jobs, it devastates entire regional economies. Expect state governments to offer new incentive packages, tax breaks, and even infrastructure investments in a desperate attempt to keep factories open. But here's the brutal truth. Once Stellantis has decided to move, no amount of local handouts can compete with the structural advantages of producing cars in cheaper markets overseas. And let's not overlook the timing. This is happening at a moment when industrial policy is front and center in American politics. The Biden administration has been pushing hard for domestic EV and battery production, while opponents argue that government subsidies are a waste of taxpayer money. Stellantis' move could be used as evidence on both sides, proof that subsidies aren't enough to keep jobs here, or proof that the U.S. needs even stronger incentives and penalties to stop offshoring. Either way, this decision has poured gasoline on an already raging political fire. Stellantis now faces a dangerous gamble in the U.S. market. By chasing lower costs abroad, they risk alienating the very people who keep their brands alive, American buyers and American workers. If consumers start to see Jeep, Ram, and Dodge as foreign-made products stripped of their American identity, brand loyalty could collapse. And unlike in Europe, where Stellantis has a broad portfolio of smaller cars, in the US their lineup leans heavily on trucks and SUVs. Those vehicles thrive on image, heritage, and patriotism. Once that's gone, Stellantis may find itself with great factories overseas but shrinking sales at home. Think about Ram trucks in particular. They've built their reputation on the idea of toughness, durability, and being built for America. If those trucks are stamped with a foreign-made label, competitors like Ford and Chevy will weaponize it instantly. Ford will shout, "Built in America," in every commercial. GM will hammer the point that Silverado is still tied to U.S. factories. That kind of marketing pressure, combined with consumer resentment, could eat away at Ram's market share. And once those buyers defect to Ford or Chevy, getting them back won't be easy. Jeep faces a similar problem. For decades, it's been sold as an American icon born out of World War II grit. Jeep ads show rugged trails, American flags, and freedom imagery. But if production moves abroad, that mythology crumbles. How do you sell American freedom when the vehicle is built in Italy or Mexico? Jeep's identity has always been bigger than just the car. It's about trust. And trust is fragile. Stellantis risks destroying decades of brand equity with one short-sighted decision. Dodge is perhaps the most at risk of all. Already struggling to stay relevant in a market moving away from muscle cars, it can't afford another credibility hit. If its electric replacements for the Charger and Challenger are built overseas, die-hard Dodge fans may view them as imposters, not successors. Stellantis may hope that performance specs alone will carry the brand, but without the cultural connection to American manufacturing, Dodge could quickly become an afterthought in its own homeland. And this isn't just about image, it's about economics. Stellantis depends heavily on U.S. profits to bankroll its global operations. American trucks and SUVs generate far more profit than compact cars in Europe. If U.S. consumers turn their backs, Stellantis will feel it on the balance sheet almost immediately. Losing even a fraction of American market share could wipe out the cost savings they gained from moving production overseas. It's a gamble that looks good on paper but could backfire catastrophically if Americans reject what Stellantis is selling. The global strategy Stellantis is chasing becomes clearer when you look beyond the U.S. borders. This move isn't just about cutting costs, it's about positioning the company where it thinks the future of the auto industry will be decided. Stellantis knows that Europe is doubling down on electrification, China is dominating EV manufacturing, and emerging markets in South America, Africa, and Asia are exploding with demand for affordable cars. By shifting production overseas, Stellantis is aligning itself with these markets instead of anchoring its future to the uncertainties of America. Europe is where Stellantis feels most at home. Brands like Peugeot, Citroën, and Opel are deeply rooted there, and the EU's aggressive push for EV adoption means massive government support for companies willing to build clean cars locally. By pouring resources into European plants, Stellantis positions itself to win subsidies, avoid tariffs, and lock in its place as a dominant player in the continent's EV market. From their perspective, America's inconsistent EV policies make it a riskier bet. China is another piece of the puzzle. Stellantis knows it can't compete with local giants head-on, but it also knows the Chinese EV ecosystem is the most advanced in the world. By building partnerships and shifting parts of its supply chain there, Stellantis gains access to cheaper batteries, advanced technology, and a massive export hub. Even if Stellantis vehicles don't dominate Chinese streets, they can use Chinese factories to serve Asia, Africa, and even Europe more efficiently than relying on American plants. Then there are the emerging markets. While America debates EV mandates and Europe fights over emissions laws, countries like Brazil, India, and South Africa are demanding affordable, practical cars for growing middle classes. Stellantis sees this as fertile ground. By setting up production in lower-cost countries, they can churn out cheaper vehicles tailored to these markets while keeping their global profit engine running. America, with its expensive labor and regulatory uncertainty, simply doesn't fit into that long-term equation. This strategy may make financial sense on a spreadsheet, but it carries massive risks. By prioritizing global markets over America, Stellantis is essentially betting that U.S. consumers will keep buying their cars no matter where they're built. But if that bet goes wrong, if Americans turn to Ford, GM, or even newcomers like Rivian and Toyota's growing truck lineup, Stellantis could find itself with strong international sales but a collapsing U.S. presence. And losing America, their most profitable market, would be a blow that no amount of global expansion could fully replace. The backlash Stellantis could face from U.S. dealers and suppliers might be even more explosive than consumer anger. Dealers are the lifeline of any automaker in America. They're the ones pushing Ram trucks on the lot, selling Jeeps to families, and keeping Dodge fans loyal with service and community events. If Stellantis shifts too much production overseas, dealers will be left with longer shipping times, fewer vehicles to sell, and higher costs passed down through complicated supply chains. That means less inventory, fewer sales, and lower profits at the local level. And when dealers suffer, they don't stay quiet. They lobby, they pressure lawmakers, and they threaten to switch allegiances. Suppliers are another critical piece. Thousands of American companies, from parts makers to logistics providers, depend on Stellantis contracts to survive. If Stellantis starts sourcing more components abroad, those suppliers lose business. And it's not just about factories. It's about the entire ecosystem of trucking companies, packaging firms, tool manufacturers, and even local service businesses tied to those operations.